Evening, everyone, and welcome to Science Pub, where we connect the community with the top minds at Oregon State University. Coming to you live from OSU-Cascades in beautiful Bend, Oregon, my name is Nathan Moses, and I will be your host for tonight's event. During tonight's presentation, The Fires in the West, we will be joined by OSU's own Dr. Erica Fischer, whom I will introduce a bit later in our presentation. Before we get started, don't forget that you can submit questions for our presenter via the YouTube live chats if you are logged in, or via the Mentimeter app found at www.menti.com and inputting the event number 9967846. And you'll see that at the bottom of your screen throughout tonight's presentation. You can also go to your relevant app store and also download the Mentimeter app. If you have a question tonight that's not answered, feel free to submit it to events@osucascades.edu, and we'll make sure that our presenter gets it. So next up, we've got a couple announcements and special updates from OSU. First up, we have a bit of news from OSU-Cascades. So research at OSU tackles important problems that face our world. Here's a video about some of the interesting work being done out there via the Natural Resources Program at OSU-Cascades.
Western North American alpine ecosystems, like what we have here in Central Oregon's Cascades, receive a lot of snow and are important for the region's water supply. Whitebark pine trees are important keystone species in these ecosystems. They create habitats in alpine systems, provide food for wildlife, influence snow distribution, reduce erosion, and slow snowmelt, increasing late-season stream flows to support recreational activities and a strong local economy. Unfortunately, whitebark pine trees are threatened by climate change, mountain pine beetles, and white pine blister rust. Ecosystems without whitebark pine trees could have fewer alpine habitats, less food for wildlife, more erosion, and faster snowmelt. Faster snowmelt lowers late-season stream flows and negatively affects drinking water and wildlife. Lower water flows can negatively affect recreation and the economy. Dr. Seth Ganshorn and undergraduate students at OSU-Cascades are working with the Forest Service to better understand the genetic identity of these trees. They climb up mountains, collect needles, extract DNA, and potentially identify differences between healthy and diseased trees. Using this knowledge, we can enhance our alpine ecosystems, resulting in more alpine habitats, more food for wildlife, less erosion, and slower snowmelt. Learn the skills to identify and solve environmental challenges of the 21st century at OSU-Cascades in the National Resources Program, or contact us to get involved.
All right. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved with the Natural Resources Program at OSU-Cascades, contact Seth Ganshorn at the information on the screen. All right. And next up, you're looking to connect with Oregon State University, interested in becoming an advocate for the university's growth and development. For 2020, Oregon State's two top priorities are the development of the OSU Arts and Education Complex and the continued expansion of OSU Cascades campus. And we'd love to have your help. Check out thebeavercaucus.org. Again, that's thebeavercaucus.org for more information on how you can help today. Also coming up is a very special event for January because it's coming right around the corner. Feels like this year has gone by very quickly. We'd like to make you aware of the upcoming 39th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. virtual keynote and award celebration to be held on Monday, January 18th. American political activist, philosopher, academic, and author Angela Davis will be the guest speaker. This is always an amazing event, so you're going to want to make sure you have that one on your calendars. And finally, for our announcements, November is going to be special in that you get not only one, but you get two science pubs to add to your intellectual enlightenment. The environment, how it affects you and your health, will be presented on Tuesday, November 17th, beginning at 6 p.m. An all-star cast of deans, faculty experts from the, deans and faculty experts from the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences and the College of Public Health and Human Sciences will discuss how human health and the environment are connected. So we look forward to seeing you next week at our next virtual event. All right, well, there's lots of things going on here at Oregon State University. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Erica Fischer is an assistant professor of civil and construction engineering at Oregon State University. Dr. Fischer's research interests revolve around innovative approaches to improve the resilience and robustness of structural systems affected by natural and man-made hazards. She's participated in post-earthquake reconnaissance team missions in diverse regions, including Haiti, California, Italy, and Mexico City, and led a team of multidisciplinary scientists in post-wildfire reconnaissance in Paradise, California. Dr. Fischer sits on the board of directors of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. Dr. Fischer has experience as a practicing structural engineer in New York and Seattle and holds a professional engineering license in the states of Washington, California, and Oregon. On behalf of the audience tonight, I'd like to thank you very much for your time, Dr. Fischer, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Nathan. And as an ode to my Bend colleagues at Oregon State, I have my Black Viewporter here ready for my Science Hub presentation. Hopefully sometime soon I can give this in person. So today I'm going to be talking about fire adaptive communities in the West. I'm going to be pulling from a lot of examples in California and a lot of the work that I've done in Paradise, California and Santa Rosa, California. And I do want to preface that I am a structural engineer. So I'm going to be talking about this from an infrastructure standpoint and from our communities from an infrastructure standpoint, and wildfires from fires in the community. So with that being said, I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to where we are with wildfires in the United States, how we got to where we are today, what are some of the major issues that we see within our communities, and then I'll leave you on a high note with some ways that we can move forward with designing our communities, and particularly what we can do here in Oregon to build more resilient communities. So there's a lot of information in the news right now with regards to how fires have changed over time, how wildfires have changed over time, and where we are with regards to the history of wildfires. So this is data from California, but it's representative of the United States with wildfires. So we're not necessarily seeing an increasing number of fires in wildfires, but we are seeing an increasing number of acres burned in our wildfires. So that the numbers of acres burned adds to that intensity of wildfires and that increased intensity of wildfires. And what we're seeing with this increased numbers of acres burned is we're seeing federal dollars spent on suppression of these wildfires increased over time. And this is this federal dollars for suppression is not FEMA dollars disseminated for rebuilding. This is not federal dollars for rebuilding. This is pure suppression costs. And the reason for a lot of this is because we are just more aware of fires in general and the hazards that these fires have for our wildfire fighters. And on top of that, our fires are encroaching more on communities, and therefore we spend a lot more dollars saving human lives. So to give you a little bit of the historical context of wildfire suppression, how did we kind of get to the place we are today? At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century is really when the United States started realizing we should probably invest in fire research as it pertains to wildfires. And that really came to a head in 1910 with the big blow up. This is when over 3 million acres burned in Montana and Idaho. And what that did is it motivated a series of policies passed in the United States around fires and protection of timber. Specifically, the Weeks Act allowed the federal government to purchase private land in the United States to protect streams, water sources, and forests. The Timber Protection Act allowed the federal government to actually protect timber against disease or fires. And we should understand that with these two acts, timber in the United States, and particularly in the Western United States, is a crop. It's just like corn or soy or wheat. And a lot of the economy out here really highly depends upon timber as this crop. So these two acts were meant to protect the crop of timber within the Western United States so that it could protect the usage of timber throughout the United States. The past policies kind of rounded out with the 10 a.m. policy. And this said that once a fire is identified, by 10 a.m. the next morning, it needs to be suppressed. And these three acts really developed a culture that when there's a fire, it's going to be suppressed. We're not going to let the fire burn. We need to suppress all fires. And it really wasn't until the middle of the 20th century when research consensus came out saying that actually fire is really beneficial to our landscape. We should let the fire burn. It actually helps the habitats of many wildlife creatures, and it really helps the landscape in general. And so it wasn't until really that happened in the middle of the 20th century that we saw in the 1980s, the U.S. Forest Service moving away from this, we have to suppress all wildfires in the wildland. And so where we are today is that the U.S. Forest Service does suppress a lot of fires, but really it's because they're trying to protect human life. Right. So as we go back to this federal dollars spent on suppression, a lot of it is to protect human life. And we are more cognizant of the risks to suppress wildfire and protect human life of the firefighters themselves. And so we're spending more dollars because we're not sending people into the middle of the forest to fight fires in person. We're using aerial methods to fight these fires. All right, so this brings us to the wildland-urban interface. So this is kind of the history of wildfires to date is, we're seeing more acreage burned. We're not necessarily seeing more fires, but we are seeing this big uptick in cost of suppression because we're protecting human life. And a big reason for that is because of the wildland-urban interface. And this is the areas in which human-made structures and infrastructure are adjacent or in areas prone to wildfire. The wildland-urban interface, or WUI, is the fastest growing land use in the United States, with over 2.5 million homes in the WUI and over 60 million people moving into the WUI from 1990 to 2010. About a third of the United States lives in a wildland-urban interface community. So we're seeing large numbers of people move into these communities, and actually today, and I don't mean just like in this generation, I mean literally today, we're seeing large outmigration from cities such as Seattle and Portland and the Bay Area. And where are all these people moving? They're moving into wildland-urban interfaces. So we're going to see even a larger uptick in people moving into these communities and at risk to the threat of wildfire. We're actually seeing these communities burn. So in the wildland-urban interface in California, land deemed wildland-urban interface between the years of 2000 to 2016, 35% of that land burned. We're going to see a large uptick based on the 2020 wildfires. In Colorado, we see 30% of that land burned. So we're seeing this more acreage burning. We're seeing large peoples moving into the WUI. We're seeing large increases in cost of suppression due to just knowledge of firefighter safety and to protect human life. And we're actually seeing this land burn. And so that comes to, well, how are we actually communicating the risk to people? Why are so many people moving into these communities if they're so dangerous? Well, because really the kind of state of the practice for assessing risk for wildfires is the National Fire Danger Rating System. And this rating system is based only on vegetation. So it's looking at communities, and this is from today, it's looking at communities of blanketed with vegetation. So it looks at weather patterns and where moisture might be. You can see not a lot of risk right now in Oregon and Washington. It's been raining for the last couple of days. And so it's not actually considering homes as fuel loads. And so when our homes are burning in these communities, homes are expending about 10 times more energy than vegetation. So, and creating more intense fires, but also, if the entire community has mitigated against wildfire, then they would have lower risk. But this danger system does not, and this rating system does not consider that what percentage of the community has mitigated. Right. So we're seeing, increase in acreage burned. We're seeing increased cost of suppression because we're protecting human lives, including firefighters. We're seeing a large number of people moving into these communities, and we're not necessarily assessing risk for these communities in the same way that we might assess risk of a community for earthquakes or for hurricanes. So now that you are all wildfire experts and you've gotten your kind of 101, I'm going to talk a little bit about the wildfire impacts to communities. What are we actually seeing in terms of these impacts? I'm going to highlight some of the interdependencies. So it's not just that a single building burnt down, but who is living in that building? And if a large number of houses are destroyed, what are the kind of global impacts to our communities that we need to think about? Because eventually we want these communities to recover and rebuild. All right, so first, let's talk about what makes wildfires an actual disaster. In order to talk about that, we actually need to accept that fires are a natural occurrence within the landscape. And that might be a silly thing to put forward, but there is this culture, and that culture from, most of the 20th century really carries over into where we are today, that fires need to be suppressed. All fires need to be suppressed. But the fires don't always need to be suppressed, and they will actually encroach on our communities. And so if they do, when do we actually consider this a disaster? And I would argue that we consider this a disaster when we lose the functionality of our communities. If we look into the literature and kind of look at consensus amongst researchers with what it means to be a resilient community, it relies on four institutions. It relies on acute medical care or hospitals, relies on water utilities, electrical utilities, and emergency management. I'm adding in schools and housing here because of the interconnections that we see within our communities with schools and housing. I'm going to walk through every single one of these. I'm going to talk about how wildfires are impacting all of these different facilities, and then we'll switch over and we'll be positive. So we're ending on a high note, and we'll talk about how to solve all these problems. All right, so starting with hospitals. In Paradise, California, we saw a lot of damage to the Adventist Health Feather River Facility Hospital. This was almost ground zero for the fire in Paradise, for the Camp Fire in 2018. I'm showing two examples of buildings that completely collapsed here. There were other buildings that completely collapsed, but there were also buildings that did not collapse. And so what I'm showing here is on the top, this was actually the maternity ward. And on the bottom, this was part of the emergency facility, the emergency ward of the hospital. Okay, so this Adventist Health was the largest employer in the town. So if the hospital shuts down, then what happens to all those people that are working for the hospital? The hospital was really great about finding other jobs for these people, for the doctors and nurses, but they're not going to be in Paradise. So what happens then? They have jobs in other places and they might move away. They don't have any tie to the community anymore. This hospital also provided affordable health care to low-income, socially vulnerable communities in the surrounding area. And so the shutdown of this hospital caused people to pay more for health care and also have to travel significantly longer, 45 minutes to an hour, to get their health care. We saw damage to engineered buildings. So what I mean by engineered buildings is something where a structural engineer would be involved. Structural engineers are not involved in the design of a single family home unless you're a celebrity and you have some really large single family home. But typically, structural engineers are not involved in the design of single family homes. So you can see that these two buildings that I'm showing you as examples, they have masonry walls, they have steel framing. This is something that a structural engineer actually designed. And the implications for the collapse of this emergency room is that, according to California's healthcare stipulations, you have to have a freestanding emergency ward in order to have a hospital. You're not allowed to have a hospital without an emergency facility, and you're not allowed to have an emergency facility without a hospital. So the collapse of this really put them in a tight spot. They couldn't reopen the hospital campus. They couldn't reopen the parts of the hospital that were still functional. There are a significant amount of school damages throughout the town. I'm just showing you 3 examples here, 1 complete collapse and then 2 partial collapses or damages. And so what this did is it displaced the children throughout Butte County. When an elementary school is no longer functional, you can't just call up the neighboring elementary school and have them absorb all of the children. I think all of us have seen that most of our elementary schools have these portable facilities outside because they can't even handle the number of children they have at regular times. So, where do we put all these children? Paradise Unified School District had a tough time finding locations for everyone. And they did, go to neighboring districts and used a lot of their facilities, but then you displaced another school. So you kind of had this ripple effect throughout the county. Most of the students in Paradise Unified School District are on free lunch services, which means that they are highly dependent upon schools for their meals. So the shutdown of schools has a very large effect on the families where they don't have access, to the support that they actually need in order to care for their children. You're obviously losing a sense of normalcy, which creates academic problems in the future, creates mental health issues amongst the children. And then, the schools are actually impacted by the tax base. So if a significantly large number of houses are destroyed, you actually don't have a tax base to support your school. So there was water contamination and electrical issues throughout the town of Paradise. This also happened in Santa Rosa. We can see that California is still dealing with their electrical shutoffs. The water contamination was due to benzene and other VOCs in the water distribution system. So the source water could also be contaminated due to a wildfire. We've seen that over and over again. But that's not what happened here. The source water was okay. It was the water within the water distribution system, because portions of the water distribution system heated up, parts of them melted, and contaminants leached into the water and then were distributed around the entire network. So it took both Paradise and Santa Rosa almost a year to figure out where were the sources of these contaminations and how do we actually fix this. In Paradise and in Santa Rosa, they ended up replacing the service lines on every single property that was damaged, which costs an incredible amount of money, takes a lot of time, and adds more complications in the rebuilding process. If you don't have access to clean, potable water, how do you reopen restaurants or grocery stores or businesses or hospitals or schools? The schools were trying to reopen for the 2019-2020 school year, and they were incredibly nervous about access to clean water. They were doing calculations on how they could circulate trucks to fill up tanks, and they just could not circulate enough trucks to fill up enough tanks to keep the school running with the potable water. So it's an incredible issue to have for our towns, and especially, in this country where we're so used to having access to clean potable water. You can see the picture on the right of all these plastic bottles. We were in Paradise, we ate lunch at a restaurant, and when we walked out back, we just saw all of these plastic water bottles. This is how they got by without having access to clean potable water. This adds a lot of carbon to the footprint of the disaster if you're using all of this plastic. With the power shutoffs, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, was shutting off power to communities during high wind conditions, during dry conditions that might be favorable to a wildfire. These power shutoffs occurred even about a year after the Camp Fire and affected Paradise and Butte County. So when these power shutoffs occurred, schools had to shut down. Kids couldn't go to school. They didn't have access to Wi-Fi. They didn't have access to heat or even water. Again, they didn't have access to electricity. Many of them were living in trailers on their land. So shutting off power hurt the community that's trying to recover, and significantly hindered the recovery process. Lastly, I'll talk about housing damage. So the two graphs that I'm showing on the left, the red dots are destroyed homes and the gray dots are no damage. The top graph plot is for Santa Rosa and the bottom is for Paradise, and we'll revisit those a little bit later in the presentation. We can see large numbers of housing that were damaged. This significantly reduces the tax base for the town. Who's paying for these utilities if no one is there? Who's going to pay for the restoration of the water network? Who's going to pay the taxes for the school to reopen? The housing damage releases a lot of pollutants into the air. Obviously, we saw what happened to the water and the soil. The top 2 feet of topsoil had to be removed in town of Paradise in order for the properties to rebuild. And it just causes mass outmigration. There was a Camp Fire survivor in every single one of the 50 United States after the Camp Fire. So, you see all of the types of damages that we can experience due to a wildfire. And so let's start talking about our language that we're using to talk about wildfires and hazards. When it comes to earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, the engineering community and even just the media in general has language to describe the hazard intensity and the hazard impact. We hear about moment magnitude for earthquake. We hear about EFs for tornadoes or wind speeds. We hear about damage indicators all the time for all of these disasters. When it comes to wildfires, this is not as common. When you listen to the news, there's all sorts of metrics that are being reported. We're hearing about acreage burned, number of homes, economic impact. It's really all over the place. And so, how do we actually compare one hazard to the next? And acreage burned might be something that is one way to compare one wildfire to the next. But when we talk about fires within our community, really we need a metric in order to compare one fire to the next so that we can compare the fires that occurred in Oregon to those in California, to those in Colorado, and we can actually put things into perspective when we're talking about the impacts to our communities. And so again, what's really common in in wildfires is to talk about acreage burned. It's also really common to talk about the burn severity. And how this is normally calculated and presented is through a burn area reflectance classification map. This uses shortwave, infrared, and near-infrared technology to calculate a normalized burn ratio. And what that means in layman's terms is we take a satellite imagery from a year before the fire, we take a satellite imagery from right after the fire. What is green before and green after has low burn severity. What's green before and brown after has high burn severity. And while this works in the wildland, this occurs on a 30 meter by 30 meter scale, which is quite large for a community, definitely larger than how our homes are spaced out. In addition, while wildland fuels do vary, they definitely don't vary as much as what we're seeing in our homes. You know, most of us, maybe all of us, are in our homes right now. If we take a look around the rooms that we're in, we're going to see a lot of things that probably shouldn't burn, a lot of synthetics that can cause a lot of energy release during a fire. And also, like I said, structures will release on average 10 times more energy when they're burned than vegetation. And so if we took this methodology, these burn area reflectance classification maps or BARC maps, and we looked at Santa Rosa and Paradise, okay, two towns that experienced significant wildfires. In Santa Rosa, in this red outlined area, there was about 98% of the structures were destroyed. Okay, that's the Fountain Grove area of Santa Rosa. The BARC maps actually predict that only had a 2.6% high burn severity and about a 47% low burn severity. Okay, so doesn't really match up with the number of homes that we see are burning. In Paradise, this black outline is the town of Paradise, and within that, about 90% of the homes were destroyed. But these BARC maps show that there's 81% low burn severity. Well, if 90% of the homes burn is low burn severity, then what is high burn severity? So we realized here at Oregon State in the research that we were doing that this just was not going to cut it for classifying our burn severity in our communities. And so you're comparing this against those maps that I showed earlier of the number of structures destroyed. And if we look inside the black outline for Paradise, you know, above and below, we see a lot of red dots, a lot of destroyed homes. If we look inside the red area up here or the yellow area down here, we see a lot of destroyed homes. And so we started thinking, well, maybe that's one way that we can actually quantify burn severity within our communities, when wildfires are impacting our communities. And so if we look at different neighborhoods, Coffee Park in Santa Rosa, this is Coffee Park. Fountain Grove is the yellow outline. We can see what the density of homes was before the fire, the density of damaged homes, and the percentage of destroyed or damaged homes. We can do the same for the town of Paradise. And the reason that we're doing this is we need some sort of metric to compare neighborhood to neighborhood. We need some sort of metric to use as an indicator variable to determine what's the probability of some other damage based on our density of damaged homes or percentage of damaged homes. And that's what we did with water contamination. So I mentioned before that there was water contamination in Santa Rosa and in Paradise, and this was due to two things. One being the home itself was a fuel load, so it was heating whatever was below it, which was the pipelines, and causing contaminants to migrate from the pipeline material into the water itself. The second way it could have occurred is backflow. So there was negative pressure that built up between the interface of the pipe and the house. And as the house actually burned down, all that soot and ash and all those things that really shouldn't be burning was sucked into the pipe itself and then distributed around the water distribution network. So knowing what all of the water samples were, where they were, and which ones exceeded California's maximum considered limits for varying VOCs and benzene, we were able to correlate density of damaged structures to the probability that we're going to actually see water contamination. So it's important for us to use language that is consistent with infrastructure and infrastructure damage in order to develop fragility curves or probability distributions that can indicate whether we have subsequent damage in our communities. Right. So it is not all doom and gloom. There are a lot of things that we can do to rebuild our communities and to build resilient communities in the West and throughout the United States. The first thing that I would recommend us doing is we need to change the conversation and language around wildfires. We can't be constantly using the same language or having the same conversation about wildfires in the wildland and then just apply it to communities. We need to talk about our infrastructure. We need to talk about what we can do to harden our infrastructure. We need to utilize policy and codes that are already out there. We don't need to start from scratch. This is not a dire instance. There's a lot of resources out there for us to use. And then we need to apply our lessons that we've learned. So a lot of the times as researchers, we go into the field, we collect a lot of data, we demonstrate what happened, but we don't necessarily learn. So the process of learning as a professor, we have to go through that feedback loop of making mistakes and then changing our behavior so that we do actually do things correctly. So there are 3 governing codes for WUI mitigation on structures. The first being the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code, which I'll focus on a lot for the rest of this presentation. The second being a National Fire Protection Association Code, 1144. And then the last being California Building Code, Chapter 7A, which covers materials and construction methods for exterior wildfire exposure. So all of these codes address how structures might ignite in a wildland-urban interface. And structures can ignite in one of 3 ways. First, being direct flame contact with burning vegetation. So if you actually have vegetation that is touching your home, then your home could ignite. So this is why defensible space is so important. Ignition from embers, which is actually the more common method of ignition of homes within the WUI. And then lastly, radiant and convective heat from nearby structures. And this is incredibly uncommon in a WUI community. This is more common in a city fire where buildings are very close together. So the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code addresses fire spread, accessibility, defensible space, and then water supply. And so it really is comprehensive with addressing many of the issues that we face within our communities. And it is for both residential and commercial buildings. But not every state actually adopts the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code. Actually, Oregon does not adopt it, and neither does Idaho. In Oregon, however, in January 2019, the Oregon Building Codes Division adopted an amendment to the Residential Specialty Code, allowing jurisdictions to adopt certain wildfire hazard mitigation provisions, but just for residential structures. So thinking back to how our communities can be damaged, we need to think about, well, what about our schools? What about our hospitals? What about our police stations or fire stations? How do we protect those more critical structures within our community? In response to this, a grant organization, Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, is now working with a number of the communities within Oregon. But you'll notice that many of these communities are more well-off communities, right? So without forcing people to actually mitigate and forcing people to actually adopt the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code, we're allowing these more socially vulnerable communities or low-income communities to not adopt it at all and open themselves up to a lot of vulnerability to wildfires. And we saw that 100% in the Oregon 2020 wildfire season. Right? And so this actually does work. So the National Institute of Building Sciences published a document called Mitigation Saves, and the link at the bottom of the screen. And it actually goes through all these different types of hazards and has extensive information on overall benefit cost ratio. While it doesn't have anything for adopting the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code, it does show that if you actually retrofit your building, there's a 2-to-1 benefit cost ratio. And that's because, going all the way back to the beginning of the presentation, there's 2.5 million homes in the wildland-urban interface. All of these homes are valued at approximately $1.3 trillion. Retrofitting them can vary from $4,000 to $80,000. And so retrofitting all these buildings actually would cost $240 billion, but save society $430 billion, right? Mainly on just the property itself, okay? So yes, there are dollar amounts, put on deaths and additional living expenses and indirect business interruptions, but a lot of it is just the pure property itself. And we saw a lot of that in Paradise. So this is some data from Paradise, California, and California adopted the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code in 2008. So 2008 is sort of the demarcation. If a home was built after 2008, then it adhered to the International WUI Code, and only 40% of those homes were destroyed. If a home was built before 2008, it did not adhere to a WUI code, and 80% of those homes were destroyed. Another part of protecting our structures, and this is talking about homes, but this is 100% applicable to commercial buildings as well, is the home ignition zone. And this really addresses those ember attacks. So a lot of what I've been talking about has addressed more of that direct vegetation contact. But the home ignition zone model really addresses ember attacks and minimizes the likelihood that flames will actually touch the home itself. And it does this by dividing the home property into 3 zones. The immediate zone, where it recommends that you have non-combustible materials, you are not storing things under your deck, you're not storing things in massive piles around you, around your home. The intermediate zone, where you are, again, having, short shrubs, not a lot of fuel load, thinking about that, the fire can't burn nothing, right? So if a fire is approaching your home, you want to have less fuel close to your home so that the fire dies out. And then looking at the extended zone, where you're pruning your trees, you're making sure you don't have low branches on your trees, which would allow for the fire to go up your tree and start a crown fire. And so what I'm going to leave you with is this conceptual framework that I did not develop at all, but I really love this because it highlights that this is not just on homeowners. This is not just on local government, but we need to be working collaboratively with our land management agencies, the local government, the homeowners, and I would even, also add the commercial business owners to really reduce our risk to home loss or building loss. And we can do this by increasing our home resistance to ignition. We can reduce human development in fire-prone areas, reduce the wildfire size and intensity, and reduce the actual occurrence of wildfires. So with that, I did want to thank all of the funding agencies that funded a lot of the research I presented you today, and the student researchers that actually did the research I presented for you today, and take any questions that you might have.
All right. Well, Erica, wonderful. And again, thank you very, very, very much for your time with that in the presentation. Really fascinating. Point of note is working with some of the neighborhood associations, especially in Bend, being in the high desert, the Firewise community, that concept around the slide you just did around the home ignition zone. Definitely seen that more than a couple times when we're doing different presentations in the areas. So that was kind of neat from your background, from the structural side, outside to kind of see some of those pieces. So really appreciate you giving that presentation tonight. For everybody in the audience, this is kind of the time for you to engage with us. So we've got some questions rolling in, but just as a reminder, if you want to ask a question of Erica that I can moderate, don't hesitate to go ahead and put that in the YouTube chat if you've got a subscription to YouTube in your profile, or the easy version, if you do not, is just going to menti.com in your device, mobile or computer at home, and enter in 9967846, that event code again that's at the bottom of the screen with us tonight. So I'll let you guys kind of let those questions start coming in, but we definitely have some that were given to us like a couple times ahead of time. So a couple questions we've got to start with is, first of all, coming from YouTube, when a single family home burns, is the concrete stem wall reusable or considered structurally unsound? And I will say, as I kind of tell everybody else, I have no professional background in this whatsoever. So I'm literally reading questions and Erica's going to help translate as we go.
Sure. I can definitely translate that question for you. So that is a great question. And that is definitely something that was very prevalent around Paradise, is trying to reuse a lot of the material. They ended up just tearing everything up. But it depends. So I don't have a very straightforward answer for you. It depends on what temperatures that concrete was exposed to. A lot of times we can actually tell that by the color. So concrete becomes discolored when it is exposed to high temperatures. So if we kind of like scrolled back into that picture that I showed of the masonry building at Adventist Health Feather River facility that collapsed, we were able to try to deduce what kind of temperatures that those masonry walls were exposed to just by the color of the masonry itself. So it becomes pinkish when it's exposed to temperatures above about 500 degrees Celsius, which is when you see serious degradation of the structural material. So, one way that you can kind of get around that is you can take samples and have them tested. But it depends on the local municipality and what they're going to stipulate. If they allow for those testing, or they're just blanketing saying everyone has to tear that up.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. Very good. Another question that's come in, and again, we will not make this political. We'll keep it as neutral as possible, but a lot of discussion around forest management and kind of who owns what responsibility and what. Is all this just the fault of state or federal forest management?
Yeah, it's a big question. So there was a big structural engineering conference a few weeks ago where someone basically just blamed all wildfires on forest management. I would say that, it's both. It's that, we need to manage our forests properly. And we need to, but most lands in Western U.S., so Oregon, Colorado, California, most of the forested land is actually federally owned. It's not state owned. So it's, you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen there. You have a lot of federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, county agencies that have to work together on the forested side. What I'm trying to argue is that, while they are getting, their stuff together, these wildfires are just not going to wait. So we need to start hardening our communities. We need to start focusing on our communities and what we can do to protect our communities. Because we haven't been properly quantifying risk for these communities. So you have a lot of high-risk communities, like, in Oregon, you have Ashland, you have Bend. But then you kind of have these middle risk or moderate risk communities. But without any mitigation in these communities, they're actually high risk as well. So if you are not mitigating and you have moderate risk to a wildfire, the chances are you're going to have a fire within your actual town itself. And we saw that this year in Southern Oregon. So, we need to start hardening our infrastructure. We need to start protecting our homes and protecting our communities, because the fire will encroach on the community, whether forest land is mitigated or not.
Okay. Well, as always, Now the questions are starting to roll in big time. So one thing here looks like maybe
questions about trees.
we got you in your element. All right, so looks like this may be a clarification on the presentation. You had said that 33% of the wildlife-urban interface burned. I suspect that you meant to say 33% of wildfires occurred in the WUI. Is that?
So I said, so a third of all the population in the U.S. lives in wild and urban interfaces. And so I think we're reflecting back to one of the plots I showed at the beginning, which showed the amount of land that burned, WUI land that had burned in different states from 2000 to 2016. So within 16 years, we saw in the state of California, 35% of the land designated as WUI had fires in it. So that's what I was saying. Hopefully that clarified.
Perfect. Thank you. It looks like, oh, this is a really good one. So a lot of homes in more urban areas, such as Talent, Oregon, don't have enough land for a 30-foot barrier around their home. Are there steps that people with small lots can do to minimize their risk?
Yeah, so this is, this is where community resilience comes in. And as an engineer, the topic of community resilience has sort of been, this big hot topic in the structural engineering community. And we saw it really come to a head in Napa in 2014 after the South Napa earthquake, where we saw that a lot of buildings and businesses were closed, not because their building was damaged, but because their neighbor's building was damaged. And their neighbor's building was threatening their building. And we're seeing that in wildland urban interface communities, the likelihood of your house burning is highly dependent if your neighbor is mitigating. So if you are mitigating and you are following all the rules and you are checking every box in the International Wildland Urban Interface, and your neighbor is doing nothing, you are not necessarily lowering your risk as much as you think you are. So this is where, we need to start looking at, rather than home by home, block by block, street by street, we have to start thinking about our community as the entity rather than the home and the property as the entity. Right. So it's really making sure that your neighbor is mitigating, so that you are who are mitigating and doing all the right things are actually reducing your risk. Because especially when your homes are so close together, as it was in Talent, you are so highly dependent upon that radiant and convective heat transfer that I showed it as like the ways that fire can spread. That all of a sudden is like coming to fruition. And if your neighbor's house is on fire, the likelihood that your house will be on fire very shortly is quite high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so funny that I mentioned the Firewise thing earlier, because I think that's a critical thing, as we feel like, again, this is not a bubble thing where we can just take care of ourselves. No. This is why, if this isn't on the list of things that you're annually talking about with homeowners associations, neighborhood associations, or other kind of grouping where you live, it should be. So that's awesome. And awesome point.
And it's not like hurricanes or earthquakes where you strengthen your cripple wall for earthquakes in your home and you're good to go for forever, or you just strap down your roof on your house for hurricanes and you're thumbs up. This is something that you're doing every single year, and you're making sure that your neighbor is doing every single year. In a town like Paradise, where there's a large retirement community, it's very difficult for these types of people to get out and start clearing brush off their lands. So, how do we make sure that for those people that physically can't do it, that we're providing resources to also make sure that they are staying safe so that we stay safe?
Well, actually, so it goes right into my next question then, so around resources. So what should the insurance industry's role be in WUI wildfire hardening? What's more critical, insurance pressure on residential customers or municipalities or government agencies?
That is an awesome question. And I would say both. So I wish the insurance agency would really step up with hazard mitigation. They have been trailing behind when it comes to other hazards. It's not just wildfires. And particularly the engineering community has wanted them to step up so much on earthquakes. And they just really haven't. So if you know anyone in the insurance industry, I'd be happy to talk to them. But it's if they can lower your premiums based on if you mitigate, but you would have to have yearly inspections, because if you have non-combustible material on your home and you don't have defensible space, then you're not really meeting those stipulations. But people, this is probably the very cynical side of me. People are not going to spend a significant amount of money when they don't have to. We've seen it for years and years. I know I keep going back and comparing it to the earthquake side, but earthquake hazard reduction and safety and seismic safety for structures has been around for way longer than wildfires. So it's, on the earthquake side, we can design to above code level performance. No one takes us up on it. So unless you have to do it, and unless there's a financial incentive, people really aren't going to do it. Mitigating for hazards is not something that is shiny. So if you only have $1 and you want to spend it, you probably want to spend it on something that you can actually see. And, in upgrading your house, rather than a lot of things that, you actually don't visually see. But it saves you in the long run.
Well, people are going to think we rehearsed this with these questions tonight, because the very next question.
I'm glad that our spidey sense is on.
It's perfect. Everybody, we're getting a ton of questions in, so thank you all for this very much. So kind of related that around the finance piece, and maybe not so much about the shiny piece, but how can wildfire stakeholders address marginalized communities, such as low-income, immigrant, non-Spanish speaking, et cetera, to better prepare for wildfires? Because, I hadn't, as you're going through your presentation, I don't know that I had thought about that exactly in that way. So what are your thoughts on that?
It is always our marginalized communities that are disproportionately affected by our hazards. I've been talking with a lot of legislatures and lobbyists within the state of Oregon to pass a comprehensive hazard mitigation plan, not just for wildfires, but also for floods, for tsunamis, for earthquakes. We need to protect our marginalized communities, and we need to provide funding for them to actually retrofit and mitigate for these hazards, because these are the people that we see it over and over again. Their support system is also going to be impacted because they also live in the same area, if not the same house. So these are people that just can't up and rent an Airbnb for a month. They're staying in shelters, and so we need to make sure that when we're talking about community resilience, we're talking about every member of the community, and that those metrics and that resilience diagram is going to look a little bit different for different areas of our community or different sociodemographics, but we can't just impose these expensive mitigation laws on towns, because that's going to push those marginalized communities out into more vulnerable communities, and it's not going to solve our problems. I would say this is like the problem of the hazard mitigation community today. So if anyone has a solution, let me know.
Yeah, that's wow. It's my head's spinning, because again, we just talked about the fact that it's not like an individual issue; it's a community issue. But then when the individuals don't necessarily have the resources that other community members might, it just further exacerbates the issue. So that's.
Yeah, and we've seen it in you can have community grants, you can have tax write-offs. There's like various ways that you can do it. But, one of the, we saw it in Portland, right, with the unreinforced masonry building ordinance. We saw what comes about when you try to implement hazard mitigation and you don't actually bring all of the stakeholders to the table. You end up hurting some of those marginalized communities that, in the state of Oregon have, there's a checkered past there. So, we have to make sure that we're doing this in an equitable way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another one, kind of agency related. So the ideas that you presented have been top of importance for those of us with an ecology background, yet the agencies still push logging as the solution. How do we, and I think maybe this is, the question's kind of on this activist sense, how do we push that along?
How do we push along, the importance,
like maybe like it's more than just the logging piece. It's more of that.
Right. Yeah. It's way more than just the forest ecologist in the U.S. Forest Service. I think it's, obviously it's about community activism. It's about making sure, I've given this presentation a number of times, and I hope that one of the right people are listening to, how do we motivate our policymakers to take this on as a really important issue? Mm-hmm. Ashland was fortunate enough to have a champion in their community to pass kind of unheard of policies for wildfire mitigation within the town. But how do we make sure that all of our communities have such a champion? How do we address that? There is a wildfire economic resilience council within the state of Oregon to talk about the recovery of the Oregon communities, and I know that the legislature in Oregon does have a lot of information in front of them right now that they're thinking about for voting. I think we have to, obviously this is really hard to say, but we do have to be patient. A lot of this mitigation doesn't come about in one fell swoop. You kind of see a little bit chip away here and there, and then all of a sudden you have, what you have. We think about how long it took for Oregon to get their seismic rehabilitation grants up and running for schools and hospitals and police stations in Oregon. Just thinking about, ways that all these different hazards can be incorporated into mitigation policies. Don't know. I feel like I'm not solving any problems that people are bringing up, but these are all amazing questions. And I hope that Oregon can take this problem seriously and move ahead in a good way.
Other good question is, now this is very Bend specific, so you might have to talk more generally about this, or you might know. What does the evacuation plan for fire specifically for Bend look like? And I guess maybe I'll take that a step further, is how would a community member know, and how would they find resources about what that fire evacuation plan would look like for their communities?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part of that question. Each town has its own emergency management. So if I live in Corvallis, so if I go and Google Corvallis emergency management, it actually brings me to Benton County, which has a ton of documents. So there are always emergency management plans that cover all of the hazards for that community. So that's how you would find out where your shelters are, what structures are actually deemed shelters in your community. It should have your evacuation plans there. Bend is really interesting in that it's actually like the hub, the emergency management hub for the state in case of a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, because there's an airport nearby. So there's a lot of information for Bend. So if you just Google, Bend emergency management plan, I'm sure a ton of information will come up. You can also call your local fire department. They should be able to, maybe the non-emergency number, they should be able to refer you to where these documents are. It's surprising how many people are not aware. And I put that not on the people, but on, it's really hard to kind of speak to the masses and get that information out there.
Yeah, I had a little bit with the solar eclipse. I had a little bit of experience working with the Tri-County area of what kind of like that transportation plan looked like. Because in that case, getting people moved around was very similar to a fire evacuation plan. So that is a big process. Kind of going back to what we talked a little bit about, it being about the community and getting the community involved. This one's pretty specific, but they're saying shifting someone who doesn't think fire is a risk and there is something that they can do about it to someone who is going to take action in their community. What do you think is some of the best motivations to do that? And I think, like, I have one top of mind that sounds like is like, organizing, kind of like I was talking about, is neighborhood association, whatever, around like community cleanups or, something like that, where it's kind of like we're all of us together. I've seen work for some people, but, are there other things around these topics that you've seen work effectively in communities, or maybe something unique that one of our communities should try?
Yeah, that's getting the community together, looking at like scenario studies. So kind of going through a roundtable discussion, and what comes out of that is like, hey, if there was a fire in this community, or if there was a wildfire that impacted this community, this is what we would expect. We'd see this many percentage of homes damaged. We'd see this much economic impact. We'd see this much people displaced. Some of that is really jarring for people to see, like, oh, wow, like that's actually my community. Because it's right, we see other communities being impacted and we say like, oh, that could never happen here. But it's most of the communities that are impacted by hazards actually, say that, we didn't think this could happen here. There's, I hope that the 2020 Oregon wildfire season was a wake-up call to many of our communities in Oregon, particularly west of the Cascades. We're not used to seeing this type of damage west of the Cascades. And so I hope that kind of is a shocker, or at least a shockwave that kind of goes through other communities of this is what could happen. And it's getting the community together and getting, key stakeholders on board. So there's always, those like 2 or 3 people in the communities that everyone listens to. And when you get them on board, people will, follow suit.
Well, and actually, so related to that, a little question I have as a secondary, you just said it, like on the west side of the state, we haven't seen this kind of damage, at least recently. Do you think it's been put in the forefront of the mind of politicians, lobbying groups, whatever, because of what we saw this year? Do you think maybe statewide it's more of an issue than it has been before? And was there a disparity before?
Well, in Oregon, Oregon is always touted as like, wow, look at Oregon, look at how they manage their lands. Like they do it so great. California looks to Oregon. It's like, we wish we could be like that. So now all of a sudden Oregon communities are being impacted. Wildfire is a hazard just like hurricanes, just like floods, just like earthquakes. There are return intervals for fires. The last time we saw fires west of the Cascades was about 100 years ago. We see it again. It's a return interval. Where climate change comes in is it's shortening those return intervals. So we have to start, I do really feel like the language that we're using for wildfires is not hazard language. We're not treating it like a hazard like we do other hazards that impact our communities, where we have, the 50-year flood, the 100-year flood. We have return intervals, for earthquakes. We have return intervals for hurricanes. We need to start talking in that language because it will shift the public's perception of wildfires and to this is something that can actually impact our communities because we're using the same language as these other hazards. So, we're going to see more fires west of the Cascades. It's going to happen. They're already projecting 2021 wildfire season to be worse than this one. So we're going to see it over and over and over again. What was particularly kind of the the gut punch this year was that we had these horrible wildfires, we had this horrible smoke, and this was in the middle of a pandemic that impacted people's lung capacities. So, the smoke and a lot of what research has been going on in the Cascadia region is that the smoke is opening up people to pre-existing conditions for COVID, and particularly our firefighters.
Yep. Oh, it's been a year, hasn't it? So actually going down a little bit about, I guess, from an engineering perspective, couple also really good questions. From an infrastructure mitigation perspective, where do above ground power lines and rail sparks fit into causing fires? And are there reasonable mitigation efforts to address these risks?
Heard about rail sparks, but above ground power lines are definitely a huge culprit for wildfires. The obvious mitigation is bury your power lines. This is what occurs all over Australia. All their power lines are buried. In the rebuilding of Paradise, they're burying power lines as well. It's really expensive, but it can save lives and communities. So mitigation is really expensive a lot of the times. It's really hard to adapt a community that already exists, rather than, build one from scratch in the perfect way that you envision. The mitigation for power lines is the obvious one is to bury the power lines. This is why a lot of the power companies are shutting off power during these high wind conditions to prevent sparks from the power lines. We have to force these power companies to mitigate, whether it's burying power lines or, actually replacing faulty parts or older, replacing older infrastructure components. But we're seeing from this wildfire season a significant number of fires started from power line ignitions, and we've seen it every year.
Yeah. Yep. Semi-related. So understanding, this person's understanding during the Paradise Fire was that when the buildings burned, the water lines to property became open lines and the reservoir drained. Is this true, and how can this be prevented?
Yeah, so it was something sort of like that. There was excessive water use during the fire. So you had a negative pressure build up at the interface of the homes and the pipes. And so when the home burnt down, all that soot and ash was sucked into the pipe. What a lot of people are doing is they're putting in backflow preventers into their water meters. So it might be sucked into the pipe, but it won't be sucked into the entire network. So it'll be sucked into the pipe up to the water meter. What has not been researched and what we're starting to do here at Oregon State is what happens when those water meters are heated up and they include backflow preventers. Are the water meters actually some of the culprits for releasing contaminants into the pipes? A lot of our water meters are plastic, or they have rubber gaskets, they have plastic valves, they have stuff that just shouldn't burn. So when we see this very hot soot and ash be sucked in, or we just see the water meters themselves being heated up, are contaminants leaching into the water itself, into the water distribution system.
Interesting. And also related to water, looks like we may have an Oregonian on this one. So this individual's property has a small wood hut that houses our entire water system plus 4 large pumps. Should this be rebuilt in concrete and steel? Would a steel roof work?
Oh man, that's a very exact question. I really don't want to be liable for this. I mean, obviously non-combustible materials would be better if this is above ground. Just as in any other hazard, your utilities are critical for your recovery. So, I would, recommend thinking of non-combustible materials. So probably not timber. And you can probably just build the whole thing out of concrete. I think what they are talking about is probably a metal roof on top, which could also, heat up, and, it depends on what temperatures it gets to, could, be destroyed. So it depends on cost. So, what cost is it, whether the finances available to do it, and, the available materials. But yeah, you want to protect your kind of critical resources on your land with non-combustible materials.
So the lesson is, if it's utilities related, don't build wood around it.
Yeah, probably not.
Excellent. Okay. And actually, because this is a really good question too, because I have no idea. Recommended exterior cladding under a WUI building. What is the recommended exterior cladding?
Recommended exterior cladding, again, non-combustible. So there's like ceramic siding. There is, stucco is also a recommended cladding. There's a ton of them. So the International WUI code is free. You can't like download it, but you can view it for free online. So you can just Google that. There are all the chapters. You can look at all the recommendations for every detail you want to your heart's desire. And it's pretty great that it's available for free online. You don't have to pay hundreds of dollars for it. And you can get suggestions for cladding, for roofing materials, for, specific designs for your vents, for your eaves, and things of that sort. Gutters, kind of can go on and on.
No, that's awesome. That's great. And then, so kind of, I guess, related to the building of homes, how can we prevent building of homes in potentially hazardous area wildlife urban interface?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually looking as my last picture as like some pictures on my phone I have of just these views of, over the ridge in Paradise. Many of these communities are just beautiful. People really want to live in beautiful places. They're just incredible. And I think, for the Oregonians on the call, we know, Highway 126 going into the Willamette National Forest is just a magical place as you drive in. So people are going to live there, but zoning has helped get people out of hazardous areas. We've seen that over and over again with flood zones. We've seen it with tsunamis, right? So we've seen that even in our own state, we've gotten hospitals and police stations and fire stations out of tsunami inundation zones. And we've done that successfully through zoning. We need to learn from these other hazards. We don't need to start again with fires. We have so much to work from these other hazards that we can build off of. So working through zoning, working through buyback programs, it's just really, really common for floods. If you see the same lands burning over and over again, the state can buy the land and just not zone it for building, and they give the family land elsewhere. We saw that in Nashville, we see it in Boulder, we see it all over the country for these buyback programs. So I hate to like push policy, but really, these places are beautiful, and I totally understand why people want to live there. And so we do really have to kind of force people out of these particularly hazardous areas that they're living, because I don't think that they would leave voluntarily. There's a lot of emotional attachment to that land.
Well, I'm looking back and forth because I got both my screens going right now with questions. I think we've hit at least pieces of a lot of them, so definitely want to thank you for that. I know we're getting really close on time. I guess to kind of end out the Q&A, and I always love this when we talk about student interaction with the work that you all are doing. First of all, it's a kudos to you. Thank you for being a great example for women in STEM. So thank you for that. You get to compliment first. Do you have resources for college-aged young women that want to get connected with STEM resources, scholarships, or employer-sponsored programs?
Oh, all right. So where do we start? Okay, so I am involved in a lot of like women in STEM and assisting underrepresented minorities in STEM fields. So yeah, so if you're at Oregon State University, then you should get involved with the Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. That is in the College of Engineering. It is fantastic. It has a weekly newsletter every single, it has obviously every single week. And it goes through all these events that happen on campus that really tap into diversity, equity, and inclusion. It taps into societies like SHIP or NISP, which is for Hispanic and Black engineers respectively. It taps into events for SWE. It has a plethora of information. It's fantastic. In civil and construction engineering, I started an initiative about 3 years ago called Women in CCE in order to provide more opportunities for women and underrepresented minorities within the civil and construction engineering school. It's not a club, it's just an initiative of faculty and the department head pushing for more opportunities for women and underrepresented minorities to feature, just amazing women engineers, amazing underrepresented minority engineers through webinars and lectures. If you are, obviously there's, Society of Women Engineers, but if you are in structural engineering, search on LinkedIn for Women in Structural Engineering. It is a LinkedIn group. It is a total grassroots effort. There are women in organizations for almost every civil engineering industry, for women in water, women in construction, women in transportation. It's actually super cool to see. Women in structural engineering is just one of them. And so you can search your city and see where those are. Get connected. Professionals love talking to students. Don't ever be scared. They absolutely love talking to students. As a student, you can email anyone, and it's like totally not creepy. Once you become a professional, you're not able to email everyone again. So that's like a great option. What else is there? There's just like tons of opportunities for women. Just like search like your field, women in, and right now there's just tons of clubs. Reach out to professors, follow people on Twitter. Academia and Twitter is a thing. It's kind of strange, but it totally is. And people love to talk to you. If you're a college-aged engineer or scientist and you have no idea what you want to do with your life, and you're just looking for guidance, look at, get a hold of your alumni registry. Alumni love talking to students and sharing their experiences. I was actually a biological engineer for 3 years in undergrad and then switched to civil engineering. And I just contacted tons of alumni and just asked them to tell me their pathway, talk to me about how they got into their field, how did they get a job at their company. I got internships out of that. People just love talking to students. So don't be afraid to contact your alumni. And if you have any questions, you can totally email me. Please don't hesitate. I'm happy to help in any way.
Well, based on the number of participants tonight, that might be a lot of emails. So
they're probably not all college age.
Right, but just bear with her if we're taking some time to get back, because there are literally about another 35 questions that I could get to that we don't have time for. So again, those of you that have questions that you'd love it answered, email us at events@osu-cascades.edu, and I'll make sure that we get those directly to Erica. So everybody, I would just like to again say thank you so so much for attending tonight. Really, really great turnout online. Thanks again for events at Oregon State University, OSU Cascades, and then a huge thank you for Erica for giving us a glimpse into her professional world tonight. And as always, a special shout out to our Connect Central Oregon crew for their production efforts. Lastly, if you have not signed up for next week's special science pub on Tuesday, November 17th, The Environment, How It Affects You and Your Health, you can definitely do so by visiting osucascades.edu/science-pubs. Again, that's osucascades.edu/science-pubs. Again, everybody, look forward to seeing you next week. Great presentation tonight, Erica. I think you knocked that one out of the park. And I just, again, appreciate everybody's questions tonight. Made it a really, really fun night. And it concludes our Science Pub for Monday, November 9th, 2020. Have a great night, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Nathan.